morning, everyone. Hearty welcome to today's research forum. And there are a lot of first years here. Hearty welcome to you too. This is our weekly research forum. Today we have Dr. Jinan TK with us. She did her research in the Department of English, College, and was awarded her doctoral degree 2 months ago. So she is an assistant professor on contract at Sallamusallam College, Areacode. Hearty welcome, Jinan.
Thank you.
And today she shall be speaking on placing trauma theory in contemporary literary research. This is a part of her doctoral thesis as well. Let's listen to her. Jinan, please.
Thank you, Asha. And good morning, everyone. The head of the department, teachers and research scholars, a warm welcome. And before beginning, I would like to thank the coordinators and thank you so much. And I will do this with a PowerPoint. So I will share my screen, okay? Just 1 second.
For those who are new to this such presentations, you can see the presentation on the right top. You can simply switch it on as Dr. Jinan is presenting.
So it is clear, right?
Yes, Dr. Jinan, it's very clear.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'm audible, right? Okay. Placing trauma theory in contemporary literary research. Now, trauma, has become a catchword of our times. And why is it a central category in contemporary theory and criticism? Literature is basically a saga of human conditions. It is the inseparable tie between pain and pleasure. And the word trauma is inseparable from literature. Literature is actually all about the attempt to present the inexpressible, like a way out to the possible expression. And it's a kind of a transition from, from being to becoming. And literature actually prepares a space to navigate into the inner core of human life and explore its ramifications. And right from the ancient times, literature has been an expression of the inexpressible suffering. We know see the words shoga and sloga. The origin of the word sloga, we attribute it to the first poet, Valmiki, who wrote Ramayana. And once he observed a pair of birds singing to each other on a tree, suddenly a hunter came and shot the male. On seeing the sorrow, that is the shoga of the widowed bird, he was reminded of Sita, the sorrow Sita felt on being separated from Sri Rama. And he began composing Ramayana in slokas. For this, we call him Adikavi, the first poet. It can be seen that literature and creative expressions have often been intricately interlinked or are always been interconnected in the backdrop of trauma. And right from the beginning of textual representation, we can find that humankind is pitted against a traumatizing other. And it is from this confrontation that the great pieces of literature has emerged, And when we examine the historicity of trauma concerns in literature, it can be traced back to Greek literature. Many of the creative outputs from Greek tragedy reflect a kind of, what do I say, a preoccupation with violence and trauma. Say, for example, the patricide of Oedipus, or the suicide of Ajax, or the madness of Hercules, or the rage of Achilles. And most of these works were written at a time of an inescapable conflict in a Greek world, where we know the war and the threat of war were kinds of looming menace in the air. And we see it was reflected in literature. And tragedy became a dominant form. You know why Aristotle preferred tragedy. And the notion of catharsis, it could be associated with the notion of cultural therapy, that which was later theorized by trauma critics. And you know, literature itself has got a kind of a therapeutic value, a power to heal the wound and to escape from wounds, the psychological dilemma. And for that, what we do is we try to narrativize. But when we try to narrativize, while narrativizing, the inexpressibility becomes a key word. You know, how is it possible to express pain, or how is it possible to narrativize trauma? So, as the dominant aspect of pleasure was centered among pain, and the question of communicating the incommunicable, or rather expressing the inexpressible, or representing the unrepresentable becomes a pivotal concern. So while narrativizing the incommunicability, we know that literature is itself a medium of expression of pain. And likewise, language is the only medium through which we are able to communicate. So both in form and content, literature is trying to narrativize the pain. It is an attempt to actually symbolize. You see the phrase non-symbolizable wound, the Zizekien formula. He says that in order to cope with trauma, we symbolize. And to quote Derrida, the non-symbolizable wound is something that is reiterating in the fictional fluidity of representation. And you know, the traumatic subject is alienated in this crisis of representation. So the concept of alienation has to be problematized. You know, in the very fundamental of alienation, both the language and the element of pain are two key terms in any discussion platform of trauma theory. So taking the concept of alienation, if we look at language, we know that the fundamental of alienation is inherent in language. We believe that the language we use is ours, but it is not ours. It is alienated from us. We think that we have a hold on the language we use, but no, we don't have any hold on, or we have no hold on the language we use. It is the language is only an incapacitated medium, to say it is only a vehicle to convey our thoughts and feelings, and language is not at all ours, and we are not able to even express what we want to express through language. And sometimes just the opposite takes place, right? What we have meant, or what we have wanted to communicate is just the opposite that we say. So all this alienation of language is problematized in the the post-structuralist parlance of thinking theory. And when we come to the experience of pain, it is also quite problematic. We cannot narrate pain as such. And the pain is not actually pain if it is not narrated. Or, I mean, the inexperienceable experience or the inexpressible experience is the fundamental of pain. So there again, we have this alienation, this concept of alienation. So there is the fundamental of alienation permeating through both the mode of expression and the very content of expression in a domain of discussion of trauma. So what happens in narration, what happens in writing is that we are making a kind of a surrogate. We are making a kind, to say, a possible outlet to narrativize the inexpressible pain. So language here comes as a kind of solace, though that mode is not completely holistic, or it is not completely capacitated medium. And there is this element of rhetoric. The rhetoricity of pain means pain cannot be completely comprehended and expressed. What I express as my pain cannot be completely communicated to you, right? So it has its fundamental rhetoricity inbuilt in it. Means it is rhetorically transmuted and rhetorically wounded, or rather rhetorically translated, and it is never captured in its full essence, and never translated in its full potential. And similarly, writing is also contaminated by its rhetoricity. We fail to communicate what we really wanted, or what we really intended to write. So this rhetoricity of pain and narration are to be considered. And there is a kind of impasse between the actual and the narrativized. I mean, between the actuality and the representation, both in the case of pain and in the expression of it. And it is in this, in this, in this enigmatic terrain that trauma theory has become an informed concept in the contemporary academic scenario, especially in the areas of cultural and literary studies. And when we look at theory, what is theory actually? I have told you right from the beginning of literature, and right from the ancient times, right from the classical times, we have the inseparable connection between literature and wound. But it is only in the 20th century a kind of conceptualization of literature takes place. Conceptualization of this idea takes place. So the conceptualization is what we call theory, and the moment sometimes is the moment when something is theorized, it becomes distinctly, an institutionally recognized component of discipline of literary study. And I told you two things: the problematic of language and language which makes literature literary. So theory, if I quote from Poltiman, literary theory can be said to come into being when the approach to literary text is no longer based on non-linguistic, that is to say, historical and aesthetic considerations. It means literature or a theory or a literary theory is always revolving around the linguistic, which means language is everything. Rhetoricity is a key term in Poltiman. Semiology and rhetoric is an essay by Poltiman. We know. So the object of discussion is not the value attached to it, not the actually the meaning attached to it, but the very process of its writing and reading, the very process of its production and reception, mediated entirely through language. The very establishment of linguistic construct is problematic. That is to be discussed. That is to be taken care of. So in the post-structuralist paradigm of thinking, literature or literary theory is all around language. And with a kind of political turn, or after the post-structuralist or postmodern turn in 20th century, especially after the emergence of the political theories like post-colonial theory, a kind of transition took place from the intrinsic or the textual realm to an extrinsic or an extra textual realm. We know Edward Said, one of the key figures in his famous work, The World, the Text and the Critic, is questioning the post-structuralist reduction to textuality and linguistic component. And it is here towards the end of the 20th century, there is a turn or a turn to political or a turn to the outside of the text takes place. And there is a small tinkling or we can say a disappearance of too much textual component in the literary theory. And he says from the beginning of from being a bold interventionary movement across the lines of specialization, American literary theory of the late 70s has retreated to the labyrinth of textuality, dragging along with the most recent apostles of European revolutionary textuality, Derrida and Foucault. It is not too much to say that American or even European literary theory now explicitly accepts the principle of non-interference, and it is peculiar mode of appropriating its subject matter, to use Althusser formula, is not to appropriate anything that is worldly, circumstantial, or socially contaminated. Textuality is somewhat mystical and disinfected subject matter of literary theory. And when we come to the present century, or what we call contemporary, we know the key terms, the key words in the realm of literature or the realm of aesthetic experience are words like disaster, politics, ethics, violence, and so on. So disaster becomes a key word in the post-World War scenario, and especially after the nuclear disasters, wars, and mainly after 9/11, the political tumults after that. And even now we have these problems like environmental disasters. Man is always threatened by the environmental pollution, and we know the flood, the tsunamis, everything, and we know all that. And the other thing, politics is also inseparable from the contemporary writings. We have national politics, we have nation-state controversies, and we have international political chaos, and so on. And there are these theories of biomass, biopolitics, and etc., etc. And these kind of political components are inseparable from theory, inseparable from literature. And with the post-structuralist nostalgia for a center, and with the post-structuralist nihilism, we may say, that took place a turn to an ethical domain of reading and writing, as the 21st century has been called as a turn to ethics, or an ethical turn by people like Martha Nussbaum. So ethics cannot be separated, and the work, The Company We Keep, is a very famous work by Wayne C. Booth, where we have the priority of the domain of ethics. Now, we know violence is also a very prominent theme of contemporary writing. You see critics like Croker designates the contemporary world order as a sort of panic, and panic is actually the key psychological mood of contemporary culture. Now it is actually a panic culture, you see. So all these are the key terms. Now, what I am trying to tell you is, from the post-structuralist world of textuality, or the post-structuralist paradigm of textuality, which is highly problematic, there is a turn to the post-structural world of political and extra-textual realm, which is dominant with the terms like this disaster, ethics, politics, violence, and so on. And when we come to these four terms, the element of trauma becomes quite dominant. And the expression through language on one side and the experience of trauma on the other side are two components that bring about the very the very constituting element of literature. And as we have already said, with 20th century, trauma theory became a very dominant term in academics and research. And when we come to trauma theory, we know the intellectual pockets like deconstruction, representation, language, psychoanalysis, violence, and everything has to be taken care of. Everything has to be taken into account. Means trauma is actually a mental experience. So psychoanalysis comes into focus, and it has to be expressed in language and literature. And we know language fails to communicate. So deconstruction comes into being. And as it is non-representable, the theories of representation are focused in the discussion platforms of trauma theory. So when we institutionalize trauma, or when we theorize trauma, all these schools come into being, especially post-structuralist school of deconstruction and the Lacanian psychoanalysis. And if we look at the very historical or epistemological evolution of trauma theory, we generally begin with Sigmund Freud. The trauma studies are inseparably connected to Freudian psychoanalysis. And it is Freud who talks about the alienation and the pain and the inexpressibility and unconscious, and about its expression through certain substitutions, certain kind of surrogates or manifestations. The latent pain and its manifest expression, what Freud talks about. All these things that come in the actually in the Freudian formulations of psychoanalysis. And as I told you earlier, Freud's theoretical formulations on traumatic experience are highly instrumental in defining the psychological notions that influence this field. Psychoanalytic theories addressing the effects of trauma or studies regarding shock and hysteria. You see, Freud's early theoretical formulations in studies in hysteria and beyond the pleasure principle, Moses and monotheism, etc. So they dominate the pioneering efforts in trauma's conceptualization as an object of study. And Freud, he argues in the study of hysteria that the actual event or shock is not traumatic in itself, but the memory of the same brings in the actual trauma, you see. And this argument is fundamental in the theoretical formulations regarding trauma studies in academics. And the role of narration and representation are crucial notions of trauma, and the very process of recalling the event brings about pain, and it gives shape to the formerly repressed expression of an experience in the unconscious, as Freud puts it. Now, this is actually extended into a kind of a symbolic order, or into a social domain by Lacan. And his query was actually whether the unconscious was deeply inside, or is the unconscious kept in the outside, in the symbolic order, or whether it is in the language. Where is it actually? And you see, Lacan's conceptualizations of a subject and symbolic order are very crucial in any understanding of traumatic subjectivity or trauma. You know, the inseparable connection between alienation and trauma gets complicated in Lacan's theoretical formulations of language and subject. And we know in the Lacanian approach to the emergence of subjectivity, we know that he says human beings enter the world prematurely without any ability to manage our bodies and communicate our needs. That's true. And without language, we cannot categorize, or what do I say? We cannot manipulate the world in the discursive practices, you know. And after a sense of fragmented self, he says slowly the structured language emerges, and out of this individual or to say human subjectivity springs. We know all that. And we know the concept of Lacan, the mirror stage, where the child becomes conscious that it has a volitional control over its own body. And it is here at this gesture of this mirror stage where the seminal emergence of language takes place, you know. And this alienation from the self, with the self in language, it actually brings about, or it causes the first trauma in subjectivity. And, you know, the normal subject who is already traumatic gets complicated in a social ambience of violence and sufferings. As we can see, when the subject encounters with violence or horror, and Lacan, in fact, fused this linguistics and psychoanalysis, and also suggested that a subject which is subordinated to the operations of linguistic manifestations. And we see, according to him, desire drives the subject towards fresh desires, and perpetually newer, and it leads towards newer signifiers and newer, but you know, that the signified remains unreachable, transcendental. And later, Kakkuzhi-Maliakkal enters the scene. She was actually she was kind of doing a kind of reading of Lacan's reading of Freud. And, you know, with Kakkuzhi-Maliakkal and the Yale critics, they actually theorized trauma theory as an institution. With Karut, we come to see a kind of a climax, or a kind of an climatic ending of the violence, which is a personal, individual, you know, gender bound, and all these external elements of pain gets theorized by Karut. And here the individual experience of pain, as it is formulated by Freud, and the cultural and societal experience of pain, as said by Lacan, get beautifully summed up in and extended by Kakkuzhi-Maliakkal. And she actually tries to, or she actually shifted the emphasis of her inquiry from the event, or the event that caused the trauma, and she actually gave importance to, or she stresses the actual structure of its experience, or its reception as definitive. And she also emphasizes on the paradoxical aspect of representation, which presupposes trauma's unrepresentability, and its role in, what do I say, integrating the traumatic memory as a part of past, and the events, you know, essential incomprehensibility. You see, in her work, The Unclaimed Experience, she writes, I quote, "In its general definition, trauma is described as the response to an unexpected or overwhelming violent event or events that are not fully grasped as they occur, but return later as repeated flashbacks, nightmares, and other repetitive phenomena." And you see, for her, apart from being remembered as something that occurred in the past, the trauma becomes a part of the very agency and subjectivity of the survivor, and is compulsively, it is like, performed in the present, as though it is a real occurrence in the present time. So she says that it blurs the spatio-temporal understandings, and her theorization of trauma's intrinsic and spatio-temporal structure, actually it raises these issues of representation, memory, etc. And we know the very core of trauma studies, the problem of representation is highly important. So she posed a question. She just asked if trauma, by escaping the conscious expression upon the impulse, manifests itself as an epistemological crisis, which upsets our perception of time and space, which repeatedly returns as spectrums. Then she asks, how can it be testified to, or rather represented, or read, or perhaps textually worked over? So this question becomes one of the major concerns of the thinking parlance. And you say these are the pioneering developments, or basic institutionalizations of trauma theory. And, after 20th century, we can find a widespread discussion of trauma theory in academics and cultural platforms. A great number of publications devoted wholly to trauma and emotional studies, and the question of how they can be represented are all the major concerns of the contemporary era, we know. And in 2004, Anne Whitehead gave currency to the genre, trauma fiction, with the publication of her work with the same name. And she actually she observes that there is an inseparable influence between trauma theory and fiction. And she says that each speaks to or addresses each other. And we see Shoshana Feldman too, where she says that the problem of representation of trauma, it creates an aporia that is inseparably linked to the literary language and witnessing. And people like Shoshana Feldman, they argue that, as trauma renders impossible a witnessing from inward, literary representation of traumatic experience, it actually displaces the referential truth or reality. And in her work, The Juridical Unconscious, she actually brings together these two marked characteristics. We can say that the two marked characteristics of 20th century. That is, she examines the invisible links between traumas and trials. And Feldman's, when we take her case, her theoretical framework was based mainly on placing together these people like Freud, Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt. And, Benjamin, she was concerned with the ways in which expression can be given to what Benjamin called as the expressionless. And, the theorists and academic researchers emphasize on the potential of fiction as an indestructible realm of representing traumatic experiences. And you see, literature always provides a platform for the belated enactment or what do I say, witnessing of what can be referred to as an unclaimed moment or a traumatic moment. Here we see this Dominique Lacapra also assumes a significant position. For people like Lacapra, trauma writing constitutes a kind of a panoramic study of historiography, depending on the testimony of survivors or witnesses of traumatic events, because they present a kind of a first-hand accounts of experiences, and the attempts to reproduce and represent the reality of the occurrence. And his work, writing history, writing trauma, is to be noted. And now you see post-colonial trauma studies can also be related to the academic field of cultural trauma. But studies connected to ethnic, gender, or religious minorities, actually they share the same preoccupation with the recovery of memory and the identification or rather acknowledgement of the marginalized or the repressed and or the neglected in the mainstream academia. So post-colonial trauma theorists opposed they actually oppose the Eurocentric formulations of trauma theory. People like, Steph Krabs argue that despite its commitment to cross-cultural solidarity or intercultural solidarity, this trauma theory actually marked by Eurocentric or what we call monocultural bias. And in his work, Post-Colonial Witnessing, he takes issues with, the tendency of founding texts of the field, like the Carothian, etc., and the studies that which marginalize or they ignore the traumatic experiences of non-Western or minority groups. And he also criticizes the universal validity of definitions of trauma and recovery that have developed, out of the history of Western modernity. And the basic emphasis they give is that the kind of suffering engendered by colonialism, it needs to be acknowledged more fully in its own terms. It should be done in its own terms, and cross-cultural ethical engagement should be maintained. So their basic motive is this. Their basic motive is to take trauma theory away from Eurocentric past and towards an decolonized future. Here we have people like Sam Durant, Michelle Ruthenberg, Robert Eagleston, etc. And we have also later the critics like Calicut, Gillian Rose, Michelle Bellao, and others who later enlarged the trajectories of or the theoretical establishments of trauma studies. And when we come to literature, the contemporary times, as we have already said, the key terms like disaster, the terms like violence, everything dominate. All these things dominate the contemporary culture. And for example, from literature, if we take any example, or if we take a work like On the Beach by Neville Shute, or a work by M.K. Wren, Gift Upon the Shore, we can see the pain or trauma is the dominant or the major theme in these works. And you see this work is from my thesis, this On the Beach by Neville Shute. It is a post-apocalyptic novel set in after the nuclear World War III, which actually destroys a major population of people across the globe. And it actually depicts the plight of a group of people who survive in southern Australia. And we know that now we know that it is hard to survive in a panic-stricken world. They are waiting a kind of a fatal radioactive cloud caused by a nuclear war. And the other work, I mentioned the other work by M.K. Wren, Gift Upon the Shore. It also presents a post-apocalyptic era in Pacific Northwest. And there are these two characters, Mary Hope and Rachel Morrow. They are actually enigmas. We see their plight in a devastated world after a catastrophic nuclear war. And these two women, they set out to preserve the wisdom and knowledge of you see the past years by saving every book they come across. And it is in this novel that we can see that this two women are trying hard. They are trying hard to preserve the books from the people, the fundamentalists, and we see the pain, or we see the trauma in each of the lines. So what I'm trying to say is that if we look at many of the writings that come out in the 20th century or the early 21st century, or the contemporary writings, violence and pain and trauma have become the key terms. And there are, as we have already said, trauma caused by environmental crisis, trauma caused by migration, refugee issues. We know the problems of Middle East, everything, and trauma caused by war, and all these things. And that is why we see that trauma could be a key term of discussion in the field of researchers these days. The depiction of trauma in contemporary narratives is actually in a way where we find that the individual or the subjective trauma at the center of the fictional world is linked to the general, general angst of the hour, and the theories, and the theories of trauma's effects on the individual subject are often used to examine the personal and the individual experience of a collective traumatic event, in a narrative. And we can apply the same, this theory in our writing, in our research writing, as a methodological tool. We have to see what kind of trauma has been narrativized, or whether the writer has been able to narrativize it properly, or if it is narrativized, how is it done, and why is the failure taking place, and when the failure takes place, what does the writer do, what is the surrogate that the writer finds, and all these things can be examined in literary research these days. And taking, for example, in the case of Gift Upon the Shore, we know that there is a kind of ethical turn, as I have already told you, in both in the form and the theme. And likewise, you could be able to trace out different surrogates in representing trauma throughout literature, like maybe like the ethical turn, like people like Martha Nussbaum asserts. She asserts the value of love. Her work, Love's Knowledge, and people like Zizek, we know recently in his work, Pandemic, he talks about an inevitable return to the political ideologies of communism, and so on. And now I would like to sum up with a quotation from Richard Rorty on the role of fiction in tuning the ethical aspect of the contemporary reading landscape. He says, fiction like that of Dickens, Olive Screener, or Richard Wright gives us the details about kinds of suffering being endured by people to whom we have previously not attended. Fiction like that of Shoulders de Lacos, Henry James, or Nabokov gives us the details about what sorts of cruelty we ourselves are capable of, and thereby let us redescribe ourselves. That is why the novel, the movie, and the TV program have gradually but steadily replaced the sermon, the treatise, and the principal vehicles of moral change and progress. And now that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jinan. It was a very clean and organized paper, and it was very deep too. We have a few scholars working on trauma theory in our department, and I'm sure this session would have been beneficial to them. So thank you, Dr. Jinan. The forum is now open to discussion. Please raise your questions and comments. First years, please feel free to use the chat box in case you don't want to speak. Please.
Okay, please. You can also use the chat box for putting in questions. If you're not directly asking questions, you can use the chat box. Please do that. Shall I just to begin so that other people also ask questions? I think you define the discipline well,
Yeah.
but still, would you say something more about its disciplinarity? How, for instance, it qualifies to become a separate discipline altogether, trauma theory? Because as you said in the beginning, the notion of trauma, okay, it's quite I would say it's difficult to delimit it. Perhaps I think your presentation in the beginning pointed to that.
Yeah.
So if you cannot delimit something, I was wondering whether its disciplinarity is brought into question. Just a stray question so that we make a beginning. Okay, please.
Yeah, I have told you that it is difficult to represent it because we know how far we can represent the pain, how far we can represent any emotion. So a central claim of trauma theory is that it creates a kind of a speechless fright that disturbs or destroys the identity. So it is difficult to even say, for example, take the case of the trauma victims, like for example, the Chernobyl victims. We know that there is a book by Kakkuzhi-Maliakkal that we all know. And she interviews these victims, and she herself pointed out that it was difficult to for them to express what they have already felt. So in fiction, we try to narrativize this trauma, and as a surrogate, most of the work tries to bring out of a kind of a turn to something, like as I have already said, a turn to ethics, or we have this ethical studies coming out in 21st century, and ethics is a dominant discipline nowadays, and many people, and they also assert the kind of importance of the value of ethical reading. You know, the very act of reading, or the process of reading, in the process of reading we encounter with the other. There we realize the pathos and pathologies, or kind of feelings that others had. So in the form and theme, this ethics of when the ethics of reading happens, we can there are kind of theories like Dominic Lacapra. He puts the theory of transgenerational empathy, where he says that the question whether why should we read a trauma of a person of a past. So he tries to answer it in a kind of way that we will have a kind of transgenerational empathy that we should have as a human being, because what happened in the past is not actually past. It is reiterating, or it is always having an impact on the present. So this kind of ethical reading, or the ethics of reading, gives importance to several disciplinaries, and it is basically that these the trauma theories actually making a kind of difference, because up to that the encounter with the other was out of consideration. The pain of others, we just read about the characters having trauma, and we just need to we just will be having a kind of sympathy towards them, but we never try to kind of having a kind of encounter with the others of or really capturing the trauma inside them. So all these theories coming after the trauma theory, it is trying to kind of bring about a change in the perspective of reading, or a change in the experience of reading, I may say.
Yeah, actually, Jinan, I had in mind people who use this word very loosely. For example, a mother has 2 children. Okay,
Yeah.
she is partial towards one. Okay, and buys her chocolates and keeps the other at bay. So I've heard it said that the second child experiences a certain kind of trauma.
Definitely.
The things you were talking about were mega events, macro experiences.
Yes, yes.
So, but this has been described as traumatic.
Yeah.
Okay, of being deprived of chocolates, let us say.
Yes, yes.
Or, I mean,
So-
partially, since sometimes the second child also gets chocolates, but the better ones land up with the elder one, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And recently, there was a discussion on who gets the better piece of fish.
Oh.
In feminist discourse.
Yes.
All the better pieces go to the husband, male
Yeah.
children.
Yeah.
So again, here is a trauma in operation. I mean,
Yes,
in the vulgar sense. If you can
Yes,
call it
yes,
vulgar.
yes.
So that is what I had in mind.
Yes,
Whether
yes.
such things have also been discussed in trauma studies.
And when we and when we take the example what you have said, everywhere this old man Freud pops out. He had already talked about the repressive elements or what was there repressed in the unconscious. And that is the basic element that Kathy Carruth picks out and later elaborates in her theories of trauma. And we know that how the unconscious is structured or unconscious has been having an impact from the childhood itself. So I was reminded of that too, and you told that example.
Thank you.
Okay, Jinan, it was a good presentation. Thanks for, congrats for that.
Thank you, sir.
Now, something, have often been nonplussed by some of the theories that you mentioned is, of course, you mentioned Dominic Lacapra and how he said that, reading accounts of, past trauma helps us or equips us with, a certain power of empathy.
Yeah.
And this is precisely what I find lacking in theories like Dominic Lacapra and Kathy Carruth and Susanna Feldman. For example, I went through countless books by these people, but I couldn't find a single reference to the Palestinian issue. All the time they were harping on Holocaust.
Auschwitz. Yeah.
As if Holocaust was the be-all and end-all of all, traumatic events in 20th century history.
Yeah.
Have these theories themselves been able to, successfully cultivate this empathy is something I do doubt. And, I came across many, I have been examining these books and never ever, in Dominic Lacapra, for example, I could find a single reference to a Palestinian book, to a Palestinian poem. They were again talking about, Primo Levi, they were talking about Elie Wiesel, they were talking about people like that. So, have these people, my question is rather, have these people, do you think, have been able to cultivate that kind of empathy or sympathy? Because if it is empathy or sympathy, I think it should be to everyone, to all human, not only to human beings, but also to our fellow creatures.
Yeah.
So have they been able to do it? What's your take on that?
Okay, sir. I should tell you that critics like Dominic Lacapra, he has actually theorized the notion of empathy in this regard, because there is a line by him where he says that he defines this empathy as an affective relation or a kind of a rapport or a bond with the other recognized and respected as other, he says so. I think it's in his work, Writing Theory, Writing Trauma. I think it's in that work. He says that there is an affective...
Jinan, my point is that he has theorized very well.
Yeah.
But he doesn't mention at all the the Palestinian instance.
Yeah, that's why I told that. Yeah, that is why the post-colonial theorists are saying that we have to decolonize the trauma theory, because even Derrida has said that we are giving too much importance to Auschwitz, and we are neglecting all the other, like they are the subjugated knowledges. They become the subjugated knowledges. We are neglecting all the other Holocaust or kind of trauma experience, such kind of traumas experienced by the people all over the world. So that is actually happening in the trajectory of trauma studies. And people like Steph Krabs, they have actually criticized this notion of the West-oriented encounters of trauma theories with their experiences, the priorities to their Holocaust. So studies are now, recent trends are coming out, giving importance to post-colonial trauma, the Palestinian issues, refugee issues, and there are studies coming out nowadays. So.
Hello, Dr. Jinan. I'm Janaki. Okay, I teach in the department.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you that I appreciated your presentation a lot because I was listening to it with very keen interest. It was a very lucid presentation, very enlightening too. It just leaves me with a couple of questions because this trauma theory has become a very, I don't know whether I'm using the right word, but a very fashionable topic these days.
Yeah.
Almost every other person is working on it from various perspectives in different contexts, etc. But I was very, taken up by the way you began your lecture with Valmiki. You quoted saying Shlogam Shogatil Ninnu Verunu, which made me, and you were trying to link it to the present day preoccupation with trauma.
Yeah.
So I just want to know, when does, from the beginnings of literature, we find that pain, grief, sorrow, these emotions in all their intensity have been the sources of great works of art, great literary works. It may be novels, it may be poems, it may be any other kind of artwork, okay?
Yeah.
But my very simple question is that when does pain or grief qualify to be called trauma?
Yeah.
When does it become trauma? How do you distinguish between pain and trauma? Because when just one little sentence more, when I read Homer's Iliad, I think it is actually a sequence of extremely traumatic incidents.
Yes.
From today's perspective. So that is another thing that I wanted to know, apart from the historically real incidents like the Holocaust or many other things that happen in the 20th century, events and incidents that happen in the 20th century. Are the readings of ancient, or earlier literature from the point of view of trauma theory? Because what I feel is that trauma theory today has generated its own set of narratives, which are rooted in the today's political context. So I just would like you, since you've done research in this area, you would know definitely more than me. So I just want you to share with us this knowledge. Have there been readings retrospectively? That's what I was trying to
Okay. And before the answer, I would like to point out one more thing. We know we are reading Shakespeare now from a post-colonial perspective, right? When Shakespeare was writing The Tempest, there was no, there wasn't a clue of post-colonial thing. But we are nowadays reading The Tempest in a post-colonial perspective. Likewise, it is after the 20th century, with the advent of the Freudian psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and later the Caruthian theorization of trauma, that this theory became institutionalized, and people began to reread the text. As we have already seen, for my personal experience, after doing a PhD in trauma, we will always try to kind of reading every text in a kind of perspective to see somewhere there is this point or element of trauma. And I always try to search for this, because the aesthetic enjoyment or the basic expression of trauma that gives us a kind of have already said that the pleasure and pain are interlinked, or the kind of pleasure we get from reading, the pain. There we encounters with the concept called the therapeutic value of literature. We always read for finding or feeling a lack that we have felt when we moved from the nature to culture, you know. So there are people who reread the text on standing on the parlance of trauma theory. And it is really great to understand that all the great classics were all rooted in the basic trauma or the human predicament of pain, ma'am.
Thank you, Jinan. What I wanted to know was, are there any specific markers that are put forward by the trauma theory to distinguish between a pain or grief, intense grief, and trauma?
I think I should go into that. Yeah.
Do the trauma theorists put forward certain specific features of a traumatized consciousness or traumatized mindset?
Yeah, they actually base this on the psychoanalytic aspects of each text. Like the traumatic subject is actually, the traumatic subjectivity is actually taken into account.
So it's the subject who decides whether am I traumatized or not. Like for instance, earlier Sharif sir mentioned, about a child feeling traumatized when he or she is deprived of the chocolates.
Yes.
Because you are feeling a sense of neglect.
Yeah.
From the child's perspective, it is perfectly valid, legitimate. For us, it looks very silly, isn't it? Because we feel trauma is too big a word to ascribe to that situation. But from the child's perspective, it's very valid.
Yeah.
So who decides what is trauma? Is it me? Or the people who are theorizing?
Yeah. In trauma studies, we have these two categories. There are cultural trauma and personal trauma. And in a larger level, the personal trauma of each individual constitutes a larger. See, for example, if there is an instance of a nuclear war or an instance of a Holocaust or something like that, it's actually a societal trauma or a social trauma. And we have this another division of it called cultural trauma, and everything is constituted by a kind of personal trauma inside it. Each society is consisted of different individual subjects, right? So they may be constituting it together. So maybe the traumatic, maybe the victim is himself feeling the traumatic experience, and there is a part given to the writer also. We should never neglect the writer. If we are taking the case of the reportages or a kind of basically the text like this voice is from Chernobyl. The reader has also a part in it. The reader has also a part in it. The writer or the interviewer or the kind of a person who writes it is also a kind of a part of the trauma that the victim experienced. And I think there are studies made by critics that there is a secondary trauma when we are expressing our trauma to a psychoanalyst or we can call it as a doctor. We are sharing the trauma. There is a kind of secondary trauma experience. When I see an accident scene and when I share it to you, you are even not in its full intensity, you are experiencing another kind of trauma. So they are all interconnected, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Jinan, for a very patient answer. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Dr. Jinan, there is a question in the chat box.
Okay.
This is by Jawhar Khan. Please look that up.
Jawhar sir is asking how trauma theory addresses instances of microaggression. Sir, can you please elaborate that microaggression for me?
It's exactly what Sharif sir pointed out at the very beginning. If you are denied a chocolate only because you are a girl,
okay,
or if you are asked to prove your nationalism because you belong to a particular minority, so how does trauma theory deal with such instances of microaggression?
Yeah, and I would like to say that this is basically rooted in the psychoanalytic perspective of this trauma theory, because all this comes, we know this the trauma theory basically says that the experience itself is not the trauma. The repeated repulses or the repeated reiterating dreams about it, or the spectrums of the incidents is actually causing the trauma. We can say that we are in an era of COVID, right? Even though we are not affected by the COVID or coronavirus, we are afraid of it. So the trauma is not in the past or the present, but the trauma is, there is no spatial temporal fixation for it, because we are afraid of something that may be happening for us in the future. So we cannot say that it is temporally and spatially situated in such a time or such a space, but it depends. Or the traumatic experience itself is kind of manifested latently, as Freud and Kakkuzhi-Maliakkal puts it. And as we, in the case of that child, as we grow up, an incident that may recall the whole trauma of the past may be affecting the subjectivity of that same person. Sir, is that okay? Did I answer your question?
Jinan has replied in the chat box.
Okay.
More questions, please.
Yeah, there ought to be more questions. I would particularly welcome the freshers, first years students. Okay. To ask some question, one of them. There are quite a few here.
Any more questions? ആർക്കെങ്കിലും ചോദിക്കാനുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ വേഗം ചോദിക്കൂ, and we'll wind up.
Okay, Asha, there are no more questions.
Sir, അധികം questions ഇല്ലെന്ന് തോന്നുന്നു. അങ്ങനെയാണെങ്കിൽ shall we wind up? Jinan, shall we wrap up?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Jinan. In fact, the speaker for today had an inconvenience, and I was in desperation for a speaker, and Jinan consented on a very short notice, and I'm extremely grateful to her. And Jinan, thank you for the profound presentation. It was very enlightening indeed, and I'm sure there are other scholars who are working on the same topic, and this will be very beneficial. I'm really happy about the number of audience we just had. There are a lot of new names and a few of our alumni as well. So thank you, teachers and students, for joining and actively taking part in the discussion. First year, there will be more forums every Wednesday coming up. So make sure you join. So let's call this a day. Thank you, Jinan. Thank you, everyone. Until next week, see you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jinan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Yeah.